Precisa ferir a pressão, medir a glicemia ou tomar uma vacina? Na Drogasil tem exames, testes e calendário vacinal completo. E o que é melhor, tem sempre uma Drogasil aí perto de você. É fácil, prático e rápido. Dá para ir entre uma música e outra. Procure nossos farmacêuticos. Quanto mais você conhece o que a gente faz na Drogasil, mais você se cuida.
The Athletic.
The race is on. So why did Red Bull really decide to keep Sergio Perez in the car, and what are the implications of that decision? And how will news of stalwart sporting director Jonathan Wheatley's departure to Sauber impact the team? I'm Ed Straw, and joining me to shed more light on the complicated driver situation and discuss the latest team principal moves is Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, we're back again, as promised, with some more information.
Yeah, it's been. It feels like it's been forever since you and I convened to record a podcast. What has it been? A whole day and a half? How have you been?
Much the same, just in a different country now.
Yeah, it's. I would say it's nice to. This I think would be probably the fourth or third. No, because we did obviously two versions of the same podcast, didn't we? So I shouldn't conflate those as two different podcast episodes, but it feels like just yesterday we were convening in different hotel rooms at Brussels Airport to record multiple podcasts. Maybe that's because it was barely more than just yesterday.
Yeah, and yet another one, because you have dug up some more on what's actually gone on with Perez, the reasoning behind the decision. So, as we said, we just learned that Christian Horner had confirmed Sergio Perez was staying on at the factory when we last recorded. So what do we now know about the exact reasoning?
Yeah, so as kind of hoped for, I wouldn't say promised, because that would make it feel like we're over-delivering or we're blowing smoke a little bit. But we did say on the last one that we were going to try and look into it a little bit more, because I kind of appreciate that the way we did that last one was a little bit more woolly than we'd have liked. So we've got a little bit further into it. Sad to say that we don't have any dramatic conspiracy theories that seem to be doing the rounds online. I find it frustrating when slightly unreliable or speculative sources are claiming things as, oh, it could have been this or it could have been this. And then that kind of does the round as like a definitive, they've confirmed that this is what happened and they've revealed that it was this. And it was like no one's confirmed or revealed anything. It's all speculation. And I don't mind people taking what we say here with a pinch of salt as well. What I will say, based on what I've kind of just hinted at, is as it stands right now, I have no reason to believe that there was an intervention from F1 and Liberty Media, and I have no reason to believe that there was a commercial benefit from Carlos Slim, for example, stepping in at the last minute to save Perez. I don't think that they've done it to secure revenue for this year's Mexican Grand Prix or anything like that. I'm sure that all of these various parties were concerned about the prospect of losing Checo. I'm sure that if they could, maybe they did, they would have tried to have some kind of conversation about it to argue. But my information, as I say, as I sit here now and record this, is that Red Bull made its decision on sporting grounds, because unless Stefano Domenicali or Carlos Slim were prepared to guarantee Red Bull the missing money in the Constructors' Championship and guarantee the bonuses of everybody in the championship who stand to lose out if they finish second rather than first, which would be in the realm of millions of pounds, I see no reason why Red Bull would have ceded on commercial grounds. So, with all of that said, sporting reasons, and the best way I can summarise it is that the core part of the conversation was, has Red Bull done everything possible to get Perez back to that early season form when he was regularly scoring podiums and was a strong second in the championship? And the answer they felt was no. That there are things that can be done more to help him more, which is what they want to try and realise post-break. They want to bring more out of him. They want to make him feel comfortable in the car. We have said multiple times, Red Bull did not want to replace Perez, but they felt that they were getting to the point where they had no other choice. On reflection, it feels like they've decided that, yes, more could be done. The other thing I would say that I believe is incorrect from the last few days is that the Verstappens were told that Perez would be dropped on Sunday night. I don't believe that was correct either. Max travelling back with Daniel Ricciardo. I think posting a video on social media probably wasn't the brightest move. Whoever did that, I don't think Max is necessarily in control of his own socials, but whatever. But travel arrangements like that are booked well in advance. That wasn't because Max knew that Daniel was going to be his teammate. And as I understand it, nothing was communicated to the Verstappens on Sunday evening to say that Verstappen and Ricciardo were going to be teammates and Perez was going to be dropped. But yeah, hopefully that's an initial kind of lay of the land. I say, I could be wrong. Happy to hold my hands up if I am, but I think it's important, unfortunately, I think it's important and unfortunately necessary to correct a little bit of what I think is misinformation.
Yes, and it's worth noting that even if Red Bull were maybe thinking, oh, perhaps we are going to have to axe Checo on Sunday night, it was always going to be decided properly on the Monday. So that tallies with everything that was being set up in advance. But you mentioned the fact that have they done everything they possibly could to maximise Perez's performance? If they've accepted that's the case, it therefore follows that they must be going into the second half of the season with some plan to change that. So what do we think that could mean in terms of how he's working, the car, those working on his side of the garage, etc.?
Well, the obvious thing, first and foremost, is potential personnel changes. I'm not going to say definitively on this podcast who I think that will be, or say this is definitely who's going to change. But to make a comparison, you remember when Alex Albon was struggling, Ed, back in 2020, that full season that he had at Red Bull, with things like feeling that qualifying run plans weren't being executed properly and that Alex's life was being made harder for him than necessary. They made a race engineer change and Simon Rennie came in for the rest of the season. So Red Bull's proven before that it is willing to make personnel changes if it thinks it will help drivers, and it's willing to do that in season. Given some of the complaints, I believe, that there have been on Perez's side of the garage, or from Perez about his side of the garage in terms of maybe not executing races properly or executing sessions properly, it wouldn't surprise me if there were adjustments to that team. Now, that doesn't 100% mean for the rest of the season Perez will have a new race engineer, for example. I know that Hugh Bird's copped some real criticism from Checo's fans in the last few races during this bad spell, but they might try something different. They might give him a different voice in his ear for a little bit to see how that goes. They could make adjustments to people that you don't necessarily hear from but make a big impact within the running of his car. So I would say that personnel changes are possible, but I'll use that Albon Rennie example again. When Rennie came back in, experienced engineer, he was Ricciardo's race engineer before Gasly and Albon came in. That didn't work. That didn't I think it did simplify things to a bit, and maybe it got a little bit more out of Albon, but it didn't completely change his situation, did it? Otherwise, Albon would never have been dropped.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's myriad factors that contribute to a driver's performance, and it's rare that just one change, even if it might seem like an obvious one, has a transformative effect. So, yeah, we can expect to see some shifts in the way of working. Anything in terms of the car? Obviously, we saw in Hungary, Perez felt with the new front wing that the feel was a lot better for him. He wasn't quite so happy in Spa. So where are we at with that side of things?
Yeah, it's been difficult to judge the car side of things lately because Perez has often been on a different spec to Verstappen the last couple of events. And, for example, he didn't have the high downforce spec in Hungary, and when they've been kind of like making big efforts to bring new parts to the track, sometimes that's meant they've only got one, and in that situation you're going to prioritise Verstappen. But there's also been the bigger picture element of, I don't know if Red Bull's upgrades are working much for the better as the season's gone on. And if you look back through Perez's drop in form through the season, and I will briefly give you the benefit of the doubt here, Ed. Let's say it started at Imola. Let's say he was fine in Miami because as we've often discussed on this podcast, that was still an okay performance, an okay result. Imola onwards is when the decline really kicks in, and that is where if you're listening to this, you've almost certainly seen the stats, how many points he's got in the last 8 races, the fact that McLaren's been catching at 9 points per race for the last 8 Grand Prix. I think Perez has 28 points in that total, blah, blah, blah. Imola was when they had a significant upgrade on the car. Now, they did have something before that. I think it was Japan was the first major car upgrade of the season for Red Bull, but then they had something in Imola. Then Spain, I think, as well. Budapest on Verstappen's car. And obviously Perez got some elements of that with the front wing, etc. Blah, blah, blah. From Imola onwards is when Perez's form nosedives. Now, the last time he was properly comfortable in the car seemed to be around China, which was the last time he scored a podium as well, I think. I think it is quite likely, based on what I've heard, that there might be some rolling back of upgrades going on. Get the car back into a state where Perez was, I guess, kind of like comfortable and confident in the car. The idea being that, and it won't be these numbers, so these are hypothetical numbers just for illustrative purposes. But let's say the 1 or 2 upgrades ago, the RB20's potential was at 95%. And the upgrade it's got on the car now, it's at 99%. But if Perez can get the maximum out of the 95% RB20, that'll be more competitive than getting 90% out of the current car. Because what he gains from being confident and comfortable will outweigh the fact that that car might be a tenth or two slower overall in terms of maximum potential. So I think we'll start to see Red Bull experiment with stuff like that. It's going to be tricky because obviously there's different types of circuits coming up. Zandvoort, super high downforce. You go to Monza the next week, super low downforce. Then we've got 2 street tracks, Baku and Singapore. It's going to depend on what Perez's comfort level is, what he prefers. They might not even decide to experiment at all. If he thinks, actually, no, I'm happy with this change and this change, but in terms of the spec, it can stay the same. But I think they'll listen to him. I think they are now prepared to make a bigger car change for his comfort purposes. And my guess is, Ed, that your response to that would be the best drivers should be able to cope with any trickiness that gets induced by upgrades or whatever. But this isn't the first time we've seen a car get upgraded away from Perez in the Red Bull era, is it? So I'm a bit torn on whether or not I think it feels like a little bit of a Hail Mary, to be honest, if they went down this route. But given the kind of history of the last couple of years, it feels like there might be some kind of like some rationale to it, even if it's a bit forced.
Well, there's a short-term pragmatic view, which is you need to get the best possible yield you can out of the second driver. So that's perfectly reasonable from that perspective, but it's not a sustainable approach. That's the main concern. And obviously, we know this Red Bull car is quite a tricky one. It has a very narrow window. The upgrades seem to have almost narrowed that even more. So it's understandable maybe that Perez has been struggling with that. So yeah, if that works, it's pragmatic. But it's not a great way to operate, because if you've got cars with different specs on 2 sides of the garage, you've got therefore sort of an offset in terms of the data, etc., etc. And while Verstappen obviously very good at getting the most out of the car, the data from the other car will have helped Red Bull at times as well. So I do wonder about that side of things.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that Red Bull's already kind of, and I don't think this was deliberate, but they've already kind of hinted they're willing to do this, because obviously they fast-tracked that high downforce package for Verstappen's car in Hungary. So they ran the cars in split spec there. And when they did that, Paul Monahan insisted that it didn't really change the way they went about things. So I'm wondering if they've kind of indirectly telegraphed the fact that this kind of approach is actually doable and doesn't come at a huge tangible cost trackside.
Well, that's the main thing. And ultimately, if Perez is struggling with the car anyway, he's nigh useless, whatever way you look at it in that regard.
Well,
so yeah, they've got to do things to try and get more out of him. And we know that Perez, when he's happy with the car, is very, very capable. He's far, far better than he's been able to show recently. Now, what do we know about the possibility that this is not necessarily confirmation that he'll be in for the rest of the year? It does seem there is a little bit of room for manoeuvre within this confirmation.
Yeah, wiggle room is how I'd describe it. There's not been, first of all, we know there's not been an official announcement for starters, but what has been announced, and I think we did touch on this when we convened to talk about it when it first emerged, this reference to tracks that Perez has previously excelled at. We speculated it wasn't, coincidence that was in there, and I think it was mentioned by design. I think the fact that he's got Baku and Singapore coming up is very important for two reasons. The first is the timing of it now. I think Red Bull felt it would be unfair to drop him if they didn't think they'd done everything, just at a time when he's cleared tracks that he's had issues with in the past. Obviously, he had that horrible mid-season run last year as well. So it's possible that whether there's a combination of, tracks that don't necessarily get the best out of the Red Bull and Perez isn't particularly comfortable at them or whatever. But and there's a little bit more hope than expectation in this rationale, I appreciate that. But if he's just gone through the worst of it and he has some tracks coming up that Red Bull feel will bring the best out of him, is this not the worst possible time to drop him? Because then you've gone through all of the bad stuff, he's cost you all the points, but you're turfing him out before he has a chance to give you some of the peaks. Because as we've said many, many times, and as Red Bull's acknowledged, the ultimate level of performance they can get out of Perez isn't really the problem, it's the inconsistency that's the issue. So with these races round the corner and the fact that they're willing to look at doing different things, whether that is on the personnel side or the car spec side or setup or whatever it ends up being, let's throw everything at it because we realise we haven't done everything we could have done up to now, and we've got some circuits coming up that will suit him. This is the best chance to kind of revive him. And then if you kind of kickstart that, maybe you kickstart a better run of form to the end of the season. So there is some logic to that. Obviously, the flip side is if it doesn't work, then it's never going to work. I think that would kind of be the logic, which is the second part of why this run of races and the timing of it is so important, because unusually we do have this autumn gap in the schedule. After Baku and Singapore, there's several weeks off. It's basically another summer break, but just slightly later on. And there's no shutdown during that period as well, so teams can carry on operating. So that's a nice sort of point to pause, reflect on whether anything has changed. They'll be slightly clearer on where the championship picture is there. Maybe they'll have lost the championship lead by that point, and it'll be too late and futile. But it's I don't know the best way of putting it, but it's a moment in time that will allow them to kind of stop, reassess, and then maybe take action then. So I think we were right to kind of speculate the other day that this is not a guarantee. He's definitely 100% in the car for the rest of the year, just that he will be after the summer break.
And then, of course, even if he does see out the season, there's the question of 2025, which we probably will touch on in part 2. Well, let's talk about some of the implications of the Perez decision, Scott, because there are other drivers involved, notably Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson. So is this Ricciardo's chance at that redemption and getting back into Red Bull racing gone for good?
It's really hard to say. Doesn't reflect well on Daniel that sort of better run of form that he was on before the summer break wasn't good enough to force his way in. But I think the slightly more the slightly more generous way of looking at it is that that's all it was. It wasn't enough to force his way into the car. And if Red Bull sincerely believes it could have done more or could be doing more to help Perez, then maybe some kind of good but not stunningly good Ricciardo wasn't enough to say, okay, well, let's bin him off anyway because we've got this superstar that we can just plug in and get better results out of. The same goes for Liam Lawson, who's a very good young driver, but he's not a guarantee of an immediate upgrade on Perez. So it's not great for Ricciardo. I think he'll still harbour hopes of getting in that car, and I think what his form recently has done is kind of shored up his position and made it so that Red Bull wouldn't, out of desperation for fear of losing Lawson or something like that, decide to just can Ricciardo for the rest of the season. So that's not going to happen. No driver changes on the RB side. But that kind of eye on 25 is significant because if Perez doesn't get it together, do you plug Ricciardo in for the final 6 races, or if he doesn't get it together and you've already lost the position to McLaren in the championship, do you have to be resigned to the fact that you've lost the championship and therefore let Perez have the rest of the season anyway and then just drop him for 25? If you do that, is Ricciardo your number one choice? Is it Lawson? Yuki Tsunoda never seems to be in the picture as far as Horner's concerned. He's slightly different with Helmut Marko, but it's a little bit tricky. I mean, what do you think, Ed? Is it a vote of no confidence in Ricciardo? That's not how I've kind of been sold it, but it's not great, is it?
It's a vote of not much confidence in Ricciardo.
Not total confidence.
Exactly. If they had... Because I think this has helped Perez, the fact that all the alternatives are limited. Would Ricciardo score more points than Perez if thrown into that car mid-season? Very possibly, but it wouldn't take much of an upturn from Perez to make that a very, very difficult question to ask. So, yeah, I think if Ricciardo had had a brilliant first half of the season, I think it would have made the decision very, very easy. Now, the main question is if the second half of the season continues in the way it has lately, because you could probably say over the recent run of races, maybe Ricciardo has been marginally the better RB driver overall. Tsunoda's had a few ups and downs. Overall, I'd still say this year so far, Tsunoda's been the stronger RB driver, but there is a trend there that Ricciardo can kind of seize on. So, yeah, I think ultimately, if I was Ricciardo, my mindset would be, right, I'm going to give it everything and try and get myself into that Red Bull in 25. They don't seem interested in going outside of the scheme. Obviously, Sainz is now off the market. I don't think they ever really wanted to risk getting involved with him. They could, I mean, one thing I'd consider doing is getting Valtteri Bottas, who's still available. And he knows what it's like to be up alongside an all-time great. If you want an interim driver for a year who'll get you some points, knows how to win a Constructors' Championship, not a bad idea, but hardly a good look for Red Bull and its driver schemes. So it feels to me like it's set up now for, if it's not Perez, maybe Ricciardo's at the front of the queue for next year, but it's still a really curious position for this team to be in. I won't repeat myself from the pod a couple of days ago, but it just astonishes me that they continue to get into driver messes.
Yeah, it is poor. I think there is a process going on at the moment to kind of reassess the junior programme and refine the process and where it picks up its talents, how it nurtures them. And it is about to sort of get into a better state again in the short term, because it's got Hadjar obviously winning Formula 2 this season, and then it's got Lindblad in F3, who Red Bull rate really highly. So it's sort of on the brink of being a conveyor belt that's churning out talents again, but it's just not quite there yet to really fix the mess that it's made for itself over the last kind of decade or so.
But at the same time, there is also a bit of a queuing effect to create, and they need to almost act now, because you're at the point where Lawson probably should be on the grid by now. Hadjar will win F2, so, well, Hadjar will win F2. Hadjar is in a good position to win F2. I went a bit far there, but that means he really should be graduating next year. So almost in amongst that process, they're already creating a little bit of a logjam.
They are, and the Lawson situation is the one that needs urgently rectifying. We've been saying for ages, and so is everybody else, that they've got to do something with him by September for 25, otherwise they risk him becoming a free agent. But
there's nowhere to go now. No,
the way the driver market's gone, so they've kind of screwed him anyway, really, because if they completely freeze on next year, you know, do they surely they're not going to keep the lineups the same. I'd be stunned. I think if Perez makes it to the end of this season, I'd be really surprised if he comes back again in 25, unless he absolutely smashes the second half of this year. And likewise, Ricciardo kind of feels like, more often than not, it feels like he's in an all or nothing situation where he either finally forces his way back at Red Bull Racing or he gets dropped, because it just feels like there's going to have to be change on some level. And it's one of the reasons why I thought Perez would be dropped, because I thought it would be the neatest solution in the short term to Red Bull, in that Ricciardo would go in at Red Bull Racing, Lawson would replace him at RB, and then Hadjar could have an intensive reserve driver role next year where he takes all of the FP1s that are available basically across the two teams, maybe leaves one for a Lindblad type or whatever.
And we should say that when Perez was first signed, he was seen as a kind of shortish term option for a couple of years. Yeah, exactly. And this is year 4 now. Next year will be year 5, which wasn't really the idea. And that's, again, creates questions about the Red Bull driver strategy.
I have some sympathy with Lawson in all of this because we know that when it was Andreas Seidel in charge at Audi, as we talked about before, Seidel was interested in Lawson and had talked to him. He was kind of one of the backup options if they missed out on Sainz and they knew that Esteban Ocon had a chance of going somewhere else. They weren't going to move heaven and earth to get him. So if they missed out on him, then they would consider either a rookie like Lawson or keeping Valtteri Bottas. But Seidel did seem completely against the idea of Bottas. So Lawson was kind of creeping more and more and more into contention at Audi and may have even had some kind of initial offer. There were definitely a lot of discussions. But obviously can't act on that because Red Bull's got first refusal on him until September, sometime in September. But now Seidel's gone there, Mattia Binotto's come in, and reading between the lines of a few conversations, I think Binotto's leaning towards keeping Bottas or, wants a driver like that rather than punt on a rookie. So it feels like...
I think he wants experience, definitely, and Bottas would be ideal.
Yeah. We're going to need an Edd Straw Valtteri Bottas corner at this rate because the last few corners, last few podcasts... You've been going there of your own volition, so we might need you to record a little jingle. But in this case, in these conversations, I'll allow it because I do think you're spot on in terms of the value that Bottas brings. So with Lawson, it's a bit tricky because I think he'll be on the grid next year. It's just he's a little bit compromised and he's still stuck waiting in the short term, which he doesn't really deserve. There is one thing about Lawson and Ricciardo I wanted to clarify as well because, again, not really sure this has been characterised correctly. So there was meant to be, there's been a test out at Imola where they've got the 2024 RB and they've got the 2022 AlphaTauri, which is the TPC program. And the plan was that Lawson would do some running in the 2022 car, but then him and Ricciardo would split the filming day in the 24 car as well. And it would be shootout is just too fine a point, putting too fine a point on it, but it would help an evaluation of the two of them in relative proximity, in the most kind of comparable fashion that you can manage. Now, there is no decision to be made now in terms of replacing Perez, so my understanding is that Lawson's solely into the 22 car rather than doing both, and Ricciardo's doing all the filming in the 24 car. And that is how I believe it's played out at Imola. And then I think it's Ayumu Iwasa who then drives the 22 car tomorrow. Then it's Ayumu Iwasa who drives the car on Thursday at Imola. This was Wednesday that Lawson and Ricciardo were running. I've just seen it mentioned a few times that all of this, completely screwed their young driver plans and the way they were handling this test. And it was meant to be Lawson in the 24 car all day because that was the car that he would drive for the rest of the year. But I believe that Lawson was always down to do the 22 car running. He was just then going to split the 24 car stuff with Ricciardo for obviously filming and evaluation purposes. But he might have still run the 24 car briefly, but I don't think he was down to after what happened. So it did change things, but not in the way that was perhaps being made out.
Yeah, well, that's going to be one of the big questions in the later part of the season. What exactly RB do, and they need to sort out this potential logjam. It's a strange scenario for Ricciardo, who once again is in that scenario where he could either be in a Red Bull or on the sidelines. Maybe even carrying on at RB is the least likely option of those three. It's very, very hard to tell, but there's still time for things to change. And again, as I always say, it comes down to performance. If Ricciardo goes in and nails the next run of races, then suddenly he's almost a shoo-in for Red Bull. So he's got the opportunity. It's there for him to take. He hasn't done it so far. Well, unexpectedly, here's an interruption from the future. This is Edd and Scott from after the recording of the podcast, because there's been yet more news, but it fitted very well into this podcast. So we've decided to record an additional bit. So we've reconvened for the 730th time this week, and it's all about Jonathan Wheatley leaving Red Bull to become Audi team principal. And this has happened very quickly, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. So hello again, Ed, which is a weird thing to be saying mid-podcast, but here we are. And apologies to anyone listening who now has to adjust their listening devices, because I might sound different because I am literally in a completely different place. I'm about 350 kilometres away from where I was when we started recording this podcast as you're listening to it now. So, yeah, it obviously came out the blue from our point of view. Otherwise, we would have factored this into the damn podcast recording from the start. But I think it's also caught Audi out. So my understanding is this has come about very quickly this week. I believe that Wheatley has handed in his resignation at Red Bull, and the announcement sort of followed on from there because of various reasons, not least because once it starts leaking out, you kind of want it to be formal. But it's clearly moved very quickly because normally this kind of announcement is coordinated. It's either at the same time or there's a little delay, or out of respect for where he's going, his current employer wouldn't normally say this is where he's going. But that's not what's happened here. There's been, as we record this anyway, I'm not convening for a third time for this podcast, Ed. There has not been...
Don't speak too soon.
There has not been, as we sit here and record for the second time, an Audi announcement. It's just...
They are very, very specifically not commenting.
No, not commenting on any element of it. Not commenting on the news, not commenting on the timing of it, or whether Red Bull might have gone rogue or anything like that. But Red Bull's gone rogue.
Not countenancing any chat on this topic.
No, Red Bull's gone rogue, though, basically. They've obviously decided to get ahead of it. They'll have their own reasons for doing that.
Which I think partly were because it was going to get out elsewhere.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this is a little bit of a rude awakening for Audi. For if you're going to go after people's staff, if you're going to go after high-ranking personnel, you can maybe expect a slightly rapid, maybe it's slightly petty, maybe it's just a little bit, this is how the game works. But they've obviously been caught napping a little bit. But that is just around the semantics of the actual announcement itself. Getting hold of Wheatley in the first place, I think, is a lovely bit of business from Audi, and I think this has Mattia Binotto's fingerprints all over it.
Yes, it does seem to have happened quickly. If Binotto has made that happen fast, then all credit to him. Some urgency needs desperately to be injected into Sauber, and Wheatley is a great person to bring in. They've got Binotto in the top overseeing job, and Wheatley absolutely knows how to run a razor-sharp racing team.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good indication of kind of what the intention is now for certain responsibilities and personnel, because when we were at the Belgian Grand Prix, Ed, there were some rumours at Spa, weren't there, that Binotto was going after the Aston team principal, Mike Crack. So there was a possibility of going there. Crack's obviously either said no or whatever conversation went on there, sort of just couldn't progress for one reason or another. But Binotto's already moved on to Wheatley. And this has to be Binotto. There's nobody else that I can think of within that organisation who would... Wheatley's not anonymous, but Wheatley's a very specific person that you target. You go after him for your team principal if you know how F1 works and you know what you want from your team boss. So that's why it feels like a very Binotto thing. And apart from the fact that he will be running the show on the team side, but as we discussed in the podcast that we did after his shock arrival at Audi was confirmed, he's not there for a bit longer officially. He's not starting in the factory until I think he basically wasn't going to be until well into August that Binotto got his feet under the table and was able to kind of make specific kind of assessments. And we were thinking, the usual 3-month process. But we also said with his specific role, COO and CTO, Binotto would need a day-to-day leader of the team principal. If he knows that that's what he's going to have, then he can start identifying people straight out the blocks, and he'll know Wheatley. He'll have worked with him. He'll have sat in meetings with him. He'll have, I'm sure, observed the way that Wheatley played Michael Masi during the 2021 season, including in that obviously incredibly controversial title decider. And basically what Binotto's done is he'll have looked at this and gone, okay, I'm going to be broad brushstrokes on this project. I'm going to make sure that we have everything in place. I'm going to make sure that we're not going to drop the ball in terms of integrating team and the engine side. I'm going to make sure that Sauber has absolutely everything it needs, but I'm also going to make sure I've got the right people in the right places. And for that, as you said, Ed, I need someone razor sharp at running an F1 team. And Wheatley, as a sporting director and team manager before that, knows everything about the actual day-to-day operations of being a successful F1 team at races. He'll have obviously had a presence at the factory as well, but he's trackside at every single Grand Prix. So there'll be things that he knows, some things that he doesn't know. There'll be some elements of it that'll be a steep learning curve. But if you're just looking at someone who doesn't have to be team principal and CEO, which is kind of a common combination that we see nowadays, just absolutely focused team principal, Wheatley would seem to have a great skill set for that.
And it's very wise to have moved quickly because there's long lead times on things like this. Red Bull, in its announcement, said that Wheatley will see out 2024 and then there'll be a period of gardening leave in 2025. Now, that could, of course, change by negotiation. They might be worried about having Wheatley around to whisper in people's ear and tempt them to move to Sauber. I'm sure that might be something that Sauber will be looking at, who they can bring in from Red Bull. Certainly Binotto will be. Nothing, I don't think Wheatley will do anything inappropriate, but who knows what will happen there. I presume they'll want to keep Wheatley on the ground, though, for the rest of the year because he is such a strength. But I just like the fact that Audi and Binotto particularly have just thought, right, he's a guy we need, get him, get the deal done, make sure we make it happen as quickly as possible.
It's wonderfully front-footed from Binotto, definitely. And I think it also... it's a really good appointment in terms of making the most of the Audi timeline, because while ideally you would have your building blocks in place already for stuff like that, when you know he's going to have a long period of gardening leave and there'll be elements of it where, you know, he sees out this season, whatever, it's not going to be Audi proper until 26. So you can afford to let him have the rest of the season with Red Bull and then have some gardening leave at the start of next year, bring him in, get him up to speed, and then have him on the ground in advance of 26 and making the most of it. It's the kind of thing where, because he's not going to come in and he's not going to have Binotto's level of influence and oversight, he doesn't need to be there on the ground right now for the other stuff around that team to start to progress and be worked on. So I think it's quite clever. It would have been a bad appointment if it was someone that Sauber and Audi need through the door tomorrow or need through the door in 3 months' time. But I think actually for where that project is and kind of where Binotto's priorities are going to be as he works through the timeline, I think actually installing Wheatley as team principal sometime next year, I think that works all right with where the Audi timeline's at.
I think it also sends out an important message internally about the raising of standards, which they need to do in the short term to show they're getting the absolute best out of what they've got. So this, for me, could signal a moment that everything moves up a gear for this operation.
That's a really good point.
Very encouraging.
Yeah, that's a really good point because, you know, what Wheatley is directly responsible for at Red Bull and what he has whipped into shape there is almost directly opposite to where Sauber's at, isn't it, on the operations side? I mean, and to be fair, I mean, I can think of one or two people in the paddock who could go in and sort of address some of the specific Sauber issues. But actually, Ed, do you reckon, like, with what Wheatley's good at and what he's been in control of at Red Bull, there probably isn't... It's hard to think of a better person specifically to tackle Sauber's kind of like trackside operational weakness.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And he's somebody who knows what it requires to go through taking a team like that up to the front. He's been part of a Red Bull team that has driven standards higher and higher over the years. So he knows exactly what the standards required are. So yeah, I can't see that being anything other than a good move. And it's obviously a good move for him personally because it gets him into really the one kind of job that's above where he is, moving up from sporting director to team principal. So it's a win for him and it's a win for Sauber.
But it's not a win for Red Bull. It is a loss for them. No. They're going to try and spin it as a positive, and there'll be elements of it that are genuinely beneficial. When you've had someone in the company for so long who has held such a senior position, he'll be a very high earner within that organisation for sure. But there's nowhere else for him to go. He was being linked with the team principal job there when Horner's job seemed to be on the line at the very start of the year. But that's obviously Horner's consolidated his power base now, so I can't see there being any opening in the short or medium term at Red Bull Racing for Wheatley. So you kind of move on a person that you can't move on and have no desire to move on within your organisation. You free up probably a not insignificant part of your kind of salary allowance, really, within not within the budget cap, although technically within the budget cap as well, but just in terms of what Red Bull wants to pay people. You're not going to replace Wheatley directly straight away, but you might get someone who comes close to approximating that impact and then can learn on the job, might bring other things in that maybe Wheatley wasn't so strong at, whatever. And then it's a knock-on effect, right? As long as if the promotions keep coming internally, there's a bunch of people there that can find themselves in different positions. That can actually be quite a sneakily good way of keeping a lot of people happy because you just have progression within your own ranks. So they'll be able to spin this as a positive. There'll be elements that Red Bull can get out of this, but I do see it as the broom's getting a lot of handles and new brushes of late, isn't it? And this is another one.
I think it's also all eyes on the Verstappen camp to see what they make of this. I can't imagine it's a particularly impressive move from their perspective. So with the whole Max Verstappen future, how does that change things? If there is a gradual erosion going on at Red Bull Racing, then certainly for 26, and because Mercedes are still circling even 25, it just makes you wonder if it just feels more and more likely that's going to happen eventually.
Well, it's the bedrock of the team's going, isn't it? It's only really Horner that's going to stay. Like Horner and Paul Monahan feel like the two really obvious ones. Obviously, Pierre Gasly as well. They think they're clinging on to. But if you look at the originals,
there's some what you call rank and file people there who are very good and very accomplished as well.
Oh no, absolutely.
So those shouldn't be overlooked. But yeah, in terms of the higher profile,
that's kind of what I mean. So bedrock's maybe the wrong, but the sort of totems of the team. So obviously, Adrian Newey is on his way out. Rob Marshall's already left. Now Jonathan Wheatley's on the go. Dan Fallow's obviously moved across to Aston Martin. These are very senior figures that Red Bull have either fought very hard to hold on to in the past or owe a lot of their success directly to and have been very prominent figures within that organisation. And not only do they weaken Red Bull by leaving, they strengthen rivals by going elsewhere. So it's interesting. And it's interesting as well that they've lost this one to Audi. It's Audi want to dine at the adults table in F1, don't they? So they're going to have to lock horns with teams of Red Bull's caliber sooner or later, and it will be interesting because whether Wheatley goes around tapping people up or not, I can't imagine he'll be so overt. But there will be people, because he's such a senior figure, there will be people who work under him and work for him and work with him who want to carry on doing that. So there'll be an element of this won't be the only person that goes there. I'm certain of that.
Yeah, and it's a question of how that proceeds and progresses, particularly with Red Bull seeming a little bit unstable. So, yeah, it's one to watch with interest. The general trend at Red Bull is a little bit concerning, isn't it? I think they feel like they're under attack from all areas and almost just being whittled away from within. So yeah, who knows where they'll be a few years down the line. Shall we hand back to our past selves now? I can't even remember what we were talking about, but I'm sure it was very interesting. So thank you very much, Scott, for this reconvening.
No problem. Thank you, Ed, and back to you, Ed and Scott.
Well, let's move on now to Alpine. We always like to talk about Alpine. We've got a new team principal, Oliver Oakes. What does that tell you about what's going on there, Scott?
That nobody seems to be able to hold down the team principal job, I suppose, but that's nothing new. We've known that for a while, and obviously we knew over the weekend that Bruno Fairman was stepping down and that Oakes was likely to replace him, so won't dwell too much on all of this. The thing that interested me most of all in that Alpine announcement, Ed, was that Flavio Briatore was quoted in the announcement of Oakes, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but someone who has been hired to be the executive advisor to the Renault Group's CEO on F1 matters, I wouldn't expect them to be being quoted in official documents. So what does that tell you about Briatore's actual position in this team?
It tells you he's running the team, and he's Luca Di Maio's vicar on earth, if you want to use that phraseology. That's the way it seems. He's the key decision maker, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think it is Briatore that's pulling the strings. I mean, it was always going to be a clash with him arriving with Fairman, because Fairman wasn't just team principal, he was the VP of Alpine Motorsports, and he'd had that Viry role before. I know that Viry got an actual technical director at the back end of last year, but Fairman, one of the arguments for appointing him, and especially at the start of this year when he took the role on absolutely full-time, not just on an interim basis, was that because he had that VP status and he was in charge of all of Alpine Motorsport, reported directly into Di Maio, he was basically in charge of the whole thing and had full oversight of the Works F1 programme, and it was meant to be this kind of move away from the vulnerability of meddling and interference from the top level and lack of clarity over who was in charge and what the actual structure was, because it was just one person effectively. I mean, he had his Alpine CEO as well, but it was just meant to be clear. But then Briatore comes in, and all of a sudden in one move, the team principal / VP of Motorsport is rendered into kind of nothing, and Faman's just kind of followed Briatore's lead on everything because he's in Di Meo's ear, so he's the one that's actually got the real influence. And there was a very telling answer that Faman gave on the Beyond the Grid podcast where he talked about Briatore, and he insisted that he has no problems with him, but he said that, you know, Briatore has his own agenda, basically. That wasn't the word he used, but that was what he was implying. He said that he does things his own way, and he said that they didn't have the same approach. So it doesn't surprise me that there's been this rupture, and I think it does show that Di Meo is not a background figure. It shows that Briatore is not a background figure.
Yeah, very, very much so. And there's all sorts of things that I've already voiced about my suspicion about what the longer term plan may be for this team, that it could potentially be part of a plan that could lead to it being sold down the line. I suspect they'll see how 26 goes with a customer engine, and then maybe that will be the point where they decide to cash out on it. But they've already said that the Alpine cars brand is the key thing. That's where they're redirecting resources from Viri to. So tough job for Ollie Oakes going in to run this team, but he's a guy who's got a lot of experience running teams now. Yeah,
obviously it's a steep learning curve being a first-time team principal, but the one thing I would say, I don't know if you agree with this, Ed, but the one thing I would say that could work in his favour and the team's favour is that Enstone could end up winning out of this, in that once all the big strategic stuff plays out and Briatore set that in motion, he will obviously be that executive level, dealing with Di Meo, all the corporate stuff on the Renault side, blah, blah, blah. The Viri side of things is almost effectively being taken out of the picture now because they're not going to be a works team longer term. Faman's over there now in his new role dealing with the fallout, and I massively respect him for wanting to go over and do that as a result of all of this. Oakes actually could be pretty clear to just focus on the day-to-day running of the team and actually give it his full attention, because he's not going to be pulled into different things like Faman was. And if nothing else, there is at least now a really clear hierarchy. And while I think when Otmar Zafnauer was there, that was the time where they had the potential to give someone full free reign of running the F1 team without someone nebulous above them in the structure kind of interfering and causing problems from time to time. Briatore could obviously well do that, like he has done with some of these big decisions, but it feels like it's these big strategy things that Flavio's going to kind of meddle with and have knock-on effects from. It doesn't feel like he's then going to be trying to run the team on a daily basis. So it feels to me like an opportunity for Oakes to kind of just focus on getting that team running properly, like just separate from all of the other stuff. He doesn't have to get sucked into all of that stuff. So maybe in a way it will let the team sort of return to that kind of way of old, where Enstone is its own bubble, basically just getting on with things, and then Briatore is the one dealing with all the nonsense from the Renault side.
Yeah, that could be for the best. That could actually allow it to work a bit better as a racing team. And to be fair, there's areas where it works well. Look at what they've done with the car that started the season so poorly. Yeah, they've had a few difficult weekends at times as well, but they've turned it around to the point where they can score points and can get a car into Q3 on a semi-regular basis. So there's promising signs there, and yeah, if they can focus on that, then maybe the Mercedes engine deal down the line, etc., can allow that team to work a little bit better. But I'm a little bit sceptical about the direction of travel from on high, let's put it that way. And how about the other expected news from Alpine that we're waiting for? Jack Doohan is set to race for the team, and he was clearly the fallback if they fail to land Carlos Sainz's services. So now that Williams deal has happened, we're expecting Doohan to get the Alpine seat, aren't we?
Yes, so not surprised by this at all. I think, after the Sainz stuff, but also once we kind of got the idea that maybe Alpine was going on Valtteri Bottas a little bit, but it felt like Bottas was definitely going off Alpine and nothing was going to be done there. And Doohan has obviously put himself in a good position there just with his diligent work in the background. He's been very persistent. He's made his case as much as he can do off track, as well as when he's done his TPC work in the old Alpine. I felt sorry for him because it feels like fate keeps conspiring against him with his FP1 outings to make those as complex as possible at times. But I think he's a really interesting pick. I like it, one, because I just like it when young driver programs kind of prove their worth and teams actually back them. So this is the first actual in-house graduate for this era of the Renault Works team since it's been back on the grid. It's had a couple of former members make it to F1 elsewhere, Zhou Guanyu and of course Oscar Piastri. But one of its own stepping up into the Renault Works team is a good thing, and I quite like Doohan. I think he's a absolutely stunning megastar, world champion in the making? I don't really think so, but he's a fascinating, not even a wild card prospect, because I think there is clearly a good driver there. But I think he could come in, and he's the kind of driver who could absolutely surprise some people. And I do think he's got some very interesting peaks.
Yeah, he's got a lot of pace. You can argue that in F2 in his last season, in 2023, he was the quickest guy there. He obviously had that cracked chassis problem that really held him back early in the year. Maybe without that, he'd have won the championship and his CV would look a little bit different. But I hear a lot of good things about his approach. He's been quite intense in the way he's worked off track in the TPC and the simulator stuff. He's played an important role. He got a few tips of the hat from Monaco in the role he played with his simulator work in turning that car from a very difficult one on Friday into one that could qualify in the top 10 and score points. So he's a very, very interesting case. It's perhaps a tough environment to go into, but yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. It's good to see a young driver who has achieved at a good level getting a chance. And I think that good pace that I alluded to and the approach means he could really make something of it. I am very interested to see how he gets on. Ultimately, there's a huge value for experience in Formula One, but I did an interview with him in Canada and he said, well, I don't have expectations of what the car should be doing. I can respond to the way that it is and learn and maximise it, etc., etc. So he's accentuating the positives of that.
I think it would also be beneficial for this organisation to have a driver that really, really wants to be part of it.
Yeah.
Because obviously it went through what it went through with Piastri. It pushed Fernando Alonso out the door, and now Alonso likes to take every opportunity he can to dig out that organisation and team as much as possible. It's ended up not necessarily his side of the garage, but the Renault side of things has obviously annoyed and alienated Ocon because he's on the way out, and it's felt like Gasly's kind of realised he didn't have anywhere else to go, not realistically anyway. And he's kind of almost there under duress. I know that he won't say this, and maybe that is a little bit unfair, but it does feel to me like that's just kind of Gasly's a bit like, oh, I've kind of made this bed now, I need to lie in it for a little bit longer. Whereas Doohan's just going to be, one, there's going to be an inherent motivation, gratitude, enthusiasm for being given his chance. But maybe that's what Alpine needs. You know, it's a young team in a few key areas, you know, quite literally in F1 terms, with Oaks coming in as team principal. You know, Julian Roust stepping up on the sporting director side seems to have had a good impact there. Maybe fresh blood is actually kind of what this team needs to shed some of the baggage of the last few years. So yeah, I think Doohan will be quite interesting. And I also think he's a good personality to have on the grid. I do think that counts for something because he's an interesting talker. He's quite open and honest. He's got a little bit of that kind of Aussie charm and directness about him as well. So I think it would be fascinating to see him come in, do a good job and have a competitive car. I don't want to see that guy come in and struggle at the back. I think you'll see the best of him off track and on it if he's in a competitive situation.
And he's also brought a good attitude to everything. He's had a year on the sidelines this year. You do sometimes get young drivers, some very good ones, who don't necessarily bring the best attitude to that. But he's taken the view of, right, I've got a toe in the door here. I've got to do everything I possibly can to make my case and put myself in the position to be the one who gets the chance. And all credit to him for doing that. He's not just expected something to come to him. He's worked very, very hard to make sure that happens. And yeah, he's got his reward. So all credit to him for that.
The one thing I would add is that we're edging ever closer to having a full 2025 grid settled, but it's another midfield one. And the only concern I have, while I think the peaks could be very high, if you compare it to Williams, for example, Albon and Sainz, I don't think this is as strong as that. And if I compare it to Haas, that is a proper coin flip as well, because we know that Gasly and Ocon cancel each other out because they've been doing it for the last year and a half. And Doohan, Behrman, I think Doohan's got a chance of starting better. Maybe Behrman's got slightly higher potential, but that could be quite... So, it's going to be fine margins, but Alpine might be in a position where even if it builds a better car next year, it could find itself losing out in the short term at the very least to other rivals, because that midfield feels like it's going to be even more competitive now.
Yeah, it's going to be super, super close next year. So it's going to be a good test of the drivers. Doohan's got his chance. It's up to him to show that he can absolutely cut it with some of those names you've mentioned. Well, thanks very much, Scott. I'm sure we'll get yet more news to fill our time during the August break. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.